In the winter of 1874, the San Juan Mountains were among the most dangerous places in North America. Towering peaks and deep valleys stretched across southern Colorado, rising more than 12,000 feet above sea level. In summer, the region could be beautiful, but in winter, the mountains became something else entirely. Storms rolled through without warning. Snow buried the trails. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Entire valleys disappeared beneath drifts of ice and wind-blown powder. Travelers who entered the mountains during the coldest months often did not come back. But in the years following the American Civil War, men continued to risk the journey. The reason was simple: gold. Across the American West, prospectors were chasing rumors of rich mineral deposits hidden in the Rocky Mountains. Some found fortunes, many found nothing, and a few vanished into the wilderness without explanation. In February of 1874, 6 prospectors made a decision that would become one of the most disturbing survival stories in frontier history. They had been staying at a winter encampment led by Chief Ouray, a respected leader of the Ute people. Ouray knew the mountains well, and he warned the travelers not to continue their journey. Winter crossings of the San Juans were deadly. He advised them to wait until spring, but 6 men believed they could make it through the mountains before conditions became worse. They packed their supplies and left the safety of the camp, heading east into the snow-covered wilderness. Weeks passed. No one saw them. Then, nearly 2 months later, a single man walked out of the mountains. His name was Alfred Packer. He was alone, and the story he told about what happened to the other 5 men would become one of the darkest and most controversial mysteries of the American frontier. Because according to Packer, the mountains had forced the men to make a terrible choice. A choice about survival. A choice about hunger. And a choice about what a human being is capable of when the wilderness closes in around them. But as investigators would soon discover, Packer's story kept changing, and the truth about what happened in the San Juan Mountains may never be known. Chapter 1. The Journey Begins. By the autumn of 1873, the western frontier was filled with men chasing the promise of mineral wealth in the Rocky Mountains. News of gold and silver deposits had spread rapidly across the American West. Mining camps in Colorado were growing, and rumors circulated constantly that new strikes had been discovered deeper in the mountains. For prospectors, each rumor represented possibility. A single rich claim could transform an ordinary laborer into a wealthy man overnight. Among the many travelers drawn westward by this hope was Alfred Packer. By the early 1870s, Packer had become something of a drifter. Like many men on the frontier, he moved frequently between mining camps, army posts, and small settlements. Work was inconsistent, and survival often depended on adaptability. A man might spend weeks prospecting for gold, then take temporary work hauling supplies, cooking for mining crews, or guiding travelers through unfamiliar terrain. In late 1873, Packer joined a larger party of prospectors who were traveling from Utah toward the mining regions of Colorado. The group numbered roughly 20 men. Most of them were strangers to one another, united only by the same goal: reaching the mineral-rich regions on the eastern side of the mountains before the following spring mining season. The journey across the high country was slow and demanding. Travel during the late autumn meant constantly watching the weather. Early snowstorms could appear suddenly and block important passes. Each day, the travelers had to balance speed with caution. Moving too quickly could exhaust both men and animals. Moving too slowly risked becoming trapped by winter. As the expedition moved through rugged terrain, the landscape gradually changed. Forested slopes gave way to higher elevations where trees became sparse and wind swept across open ridges. Streams froze along their edges, and frost coated the ground during the early morning hours. The travelers knew winter was approaching quickly. By January of 1874, the party had reached an encampment belonging to the Ute people, led by Chief Ouray. The camp was located near what was then known as the Los Pinos Indian Agency in southwestern Colorado. The agency served as a meeting place between the Ute communities and representatives of the United States government. For travelers moving through the region, it also offered a rare opportunity to rest, obtain supplies, and gather information about the surrounding mountains. The arrival of the prospectors was not unusual. Frontier travel routes frequently crossed lands traditionally used by Native American tribes, and interactions between travelers and local communities occurred regularly. Some meetings were tense, particularly as increasing numbers of settlers entered native territory. Others were cooperative, especially when both sides recognized the dangers of the environment they shared. Chief Ouray had developed a reputation for diplomacy and leadership. Known for his intelligence and calm judgment, he often acted as a mediator between the Ute people and American officials. Travelers who encountered him frequently described him as cautious but fair. When the group of prospectors arrived at the winter camp, they were already exhausted from weeks of travel. Supplies were running low, and several men were suffering from the effects of cold weather and poor nutrition. The camp offered temporary relief. The travelers were given food and a place to rest while they considered their next move. But the situation presented a difficult decision. Winter in the mountains had already begun. Snow had accumulated across many of the higher passes. For people familiar with the region, this was a warning sign. Travel through the San Juan Mountains during midwinter was extremely dangerous. Deep snow could slow movement to only a few miles per day. Storms could trap travelers for weeks. Even experienced mountain men sometimes avoided winter crossings entirely. Chief Ouray reportedly advised the travelers to remain at the camp until spring. Waiting several months would allow the snow to melt and make the trails safer. It was practical advice, grounded in a deep understanding of the land. Many of the prospectors agreed. After weeks of difficult travel, the opportunity to remain in relative safety was appealing. Food and shelter were available, and the men could prepare for a safer journey once the weather improved. But not everyone wanted to wait. A smaller group within the party believed that continuing the journey immediately offered advantages. If they could reach the mining settlements ahead of other prospectors, they might secure valuable claims before competition increased in the spring. The difference of a few months could determine whether a prospector discovered a profitable site or arrived too late. The decision created a split among the travelers. Ultimately, 6 men chose to leave the safety of the Ute encampment and attempt the crossing themselves. The group consisted of Shannon Wilson Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, George Noon, Israel Swan, and Alfred Packer. Each man brought his own background and experience to the journey. Some had spent years working in mining camps throughout the Western Territories. Others had less experience but shared the same determination to reach the gold fields. Like many prospectors, they carried limited supplies. Their packs included flour for making simple bread, coffee for warmth and energy, and small amounts of preserved meat. They also carried rifles and ammunition in case hunting became necessary. Food planning was a constant challenge for travelers in the mountains. Supplies had to be light enough to carry while still lasting long enough to reach the next settlement. If conditions slowed the journey, rations could quickly become dangerously low. Alfred Packer presented himself as someone familiar with the region. He claimed to have experience navigating mountain routes and offered to guide the smaller group across the San Juans. Whether he truly possessed that knowledge remains uncertain. Later accounts would raise questions about how well he actually understood the terrain. Nevertheless, the other men accepted his guidance. On February 9, 1874, the 6 travelers left the encampment and began moving eastward into the mountains. The decision marked the beginning of a journey that would soon become one of the most infamous survival stories in American frontier history. At first, their progress may have seemed manageable. Fresh snow covered the ground, but the men likely believed they could still follow known routes through the valleys and passes. Winter travel required constant effort. Each step through deep snow drained energy, and maintaining body warmth demanded additional calories that their limited food supplies could barely provide. The men probably relied heavily on hunting to supplement their rations. Deer, elk, and smaller game animals sometimes remained active during winter months, though finding them in deep snow could be difficult. Ammunition was limited, and a missed shot represented more than disappointment. It meant wasted opportunity for survival. As the group moved deeper into the San Juan Mountains, the distance between them and any form of assistance grew larger. The landscape around them was vast and largely uninhabited. Settlements were scattered far apart, and few people traveled through the region during winter. Behind them lay the relative safety of the Ute encampment they had chosen to leave. Ahead of them stretched miles of frozen wilderness. At the time, none of the 6 men could have known that their decision would soon become the center of a mystery that would haunt the American West for decades. Because once the travelers disappeared into the mountains, no one would see 5 of them alive again. Chapter 2. Lost in the San Juans. After leaving the safety of Chief Urey's encampment on February 9, 1874, the 6 prospectors moved deeper into the San Juan Mountains. At first, the decision to continue may have seemed reasonable. Many frontier travelers believed that determination and careful travel could overcome most natural obstacles. The men likely assumed that if they kept moving steadily, they would eventually reach the mining settlements somewhere beyond the mountains. But the San Juans in winter were not a place where determination alone guaranteed survival. The group quickly discovered that traveling through deep mountain snow was far slower and more exhausting than expected. Snow in the high country often accumulated several feet deep, particularly in valleys and sheltered areas where wind carried drifting powder. Each step required effort. Boots sank into the snow, forcing the men to lift their legs repeatedly just to move forward a few feet at a time. Progress that might have taken a single day during the summer could now require several days of laborious travel. Cold temperatures made the journey even more difficult. At elevations above 10,000 feet, nighttime temperatures frequently dropped far below freezing. Without proper shelter, the men were forced to build fires whenever they stopped, both for warmth and for cooking what little food they had brought with them. Firewood could sometimes be gathered from nearby trees, but storms often covered fallen branches with heavy snow, making them difficult to find. The men carried only limited supplies. Flour, coffee, and small quantities of preserved meat formed the core of their rations. These foods were simple but effective when carefully managed. However, the human body burns enormous amounts of energy while traveling in freezing temperatures. Every hour spent pushing through deep snow consumed calories that their small stores of food could barely replace. Within days, the group likely began rationing their supplies. Rationing was a common practice among frontier travelers. Meals were reduced to the smallest amounts necessary to maintain strength. Bread made from flour and water might be shared among several men. Coffee, though offering little nutrition, provided warmth and temporary energy. Meat, if available, was carefully divided so that nothing was wasted. But rations could only last so long. Hunting offered one possible solution. Winter animals such as deer or elk sometimes moved through the lower valleys, searching for exposed vegetation beneath the snow. A successful hunt could provide several days' worth of food. Yet hunting in deep winter conditions was unpredictable. Animals were scarce, and the heavy snow often made tracking them difficult. A hunter might spend hours following faint signs through the forest only to lose the trail entirely. The men carried rifles, but ammunition was limited. Every shot had to count. If the group was unable to find game, they would have been forced to rely entirely on their dwindling food supply. As the days passed, the situation likely grew increasingly serious. Physical exhaustion would have set in quickly. Traveling through snow while carrying equipment required constant exertion. Muscles weakened as food supplies decreased. The men would have needed to rest frequently, but stopping too often risked losing precious time. Storms may have slowed them further. Winter weather in the San Juan Mountains can change rapidly. A clear morning may be followed by heavy snowfall by afternoon. Strong winds can sweep across ridgelines, creating whiteout conditions that obscure the landscape entirely. During severe storms, travelers sometimes have no choice but to remain in place, waiting for the weather to improve. If the group encountered such storms, they may have been forced to remain in temporary camps for days at a time. During those pauses, food consumption continued while progress stopped. Eventually, the supplies the men carried from the Ute camp would have run dangerously low. Desperation forced frontier travelers to consider options they might otherwise never attempt. One of the most commonly reported survival measures was the consumption of leather. Boots, belts, and equipment straps were often made from thick animal hide. When boiled in water for long periods, leather softens enough to chew and swallow. Although it provided almost no nutritional value, leather could temporarily reduce the sensation of hunger. Historical accounts of mountain expeditions frequently mention this grim practice. For starving travelers, it represented one of the last remaining resources when all other food had disappeared. At some point during their journey, the six men may have reached that stage. The psychological effects of starvation would have added another layer of danger to the expedition. As the human body loses access to sufficient calories, mental clarity begins to decline. Decision-making becomes more difficult. Small disagreements can grow into serious conflicts. Irritability and confusion are common symptoms. In a small group struggling for survival, such tensions could quickly become dangerous. It is impossible to know exactly how the relationships between the six men evolved during those weeks in the mountains. Frontier expeditions often relied heavily on cooperation. Each man depended on the others for support, assistance, and shared labor. But when resources became scarce, that cooperation could be strained. The terrain surrounding them offered little relief. The San Juan Mountains contain countless narrow valleys, steep ridges, and hidden basins. In winter, these features become difficult to distinguish beneath deep snow. A valley that appears to lead toward lower ground may instead end abruptly at a steep canyon wall. A ridge that promises a clear route forward may descend into another maze of forested slopes. Without reliable landmarks or established trails, the travelers may have struggled to determine their exact location. Maps of the region in the 1870s were incomplete. Many of the smaller valleys and passes had never been carefully surveyed. Navigation often depended on experience with the land itself, knowledge that some members of the group may not have possessed. As days turned into weeks, the six men were likely moving through one of the most isolated regions of the American West. Behind them lay the route they had already traveled, now buried beneath fresh snowfall. Ahead of them stretched unknown terrain. Outside their small group, no one knew their exact location. The rest of the prospectors who had remained at the Ute encampment could only assume the travelers were slowly making their way through the mountains. Communication between distant camps was nearly impossible during winter. If the six men encountered trouble, there would be no rescue party coming to find them. The wilderness around them was vast and silent. Somewhere within that silent landscape, events unfolded that would later become the center of intense investigation and speculation. Exactly what happened among the six travelers remains one of the most debated mysteries of frontier history. What is known is this: weeks passed without any sign of the men. No travelers reported seeing them along the trails leading toward the mining settlements. No letters or messages reached nearby towns. The mountains gave no indication of what had become of the expedition. Then, in the early spring of 1874, a single survivor would finally emerge from the wilderness. He arrived alone, and the story he told would shock everyone who heard it. Chapter 3: The Man Who Came Back. Nearly 2 months after the six prospectors had left the safety of the Ute encampment, a lone man emerged from the wilderness. On April 16, 1874, Alfred Packer arrived at the Los Pinos Indian Agency in southwestern Colorado. The agency served as an administrative center where government representatives interacted with the Ute communities living in the region. It was also a place where travelers sometimes stopped to rest, obtain supplies, or report news from distant settlements. When Packer walked into the agency, the first reaction among those present was relief. The small party that had left during the winter had not been seen since February, and their fate had been uncertain. Seeing one of the men return suggested that the others might simply be traveling behind him, but the relief did not last long. Observers quickly noticed that Packer did not appear to be a man who had barely survived a brutal mountain crossing. Frontier travelers who endured weeks of starvation typically arrived exhausted and emaciated. Their clothing was often damaged, and they were usually weak from hunger and exposure. Packer's condition raised questions. Accounts from witnesses suggest that he appeared relatively well fed. He was able to walk without difficulty, and his physical condition did not seem to match the kind of extreme deprivation normally associated with surviving weeks in the frozen mountains. This discrepancy immediately caught the attention of the people at the agency. There were other details that seemed unusual. Packer carried with him several possessions that did not appear to belong to him. Among the items were money, firearms, and personal equipment that investigators would later determine had belonged to the other members of the expedition. In frontier communities where most travelers owned only a few valuable belongings, such items were easily recognized. Naturally, people began asking questions. At first, Packer provided a simple explanation. According to his initial account, the group had encountered severe winter conditions in the mountains. Food supplies had quickly run out, and the men were forced to survive however they could. One by one, his companions had died from starvation and exposure. Packer claimed that he had been the last survivor. In his telling, desperation eventually forced him to eat the flesh of those who had died before him. Cannibalism, though shocking, was not completely unheard of in extreme survival situations. Historical accounts from various expeditions describe similar actions when travelers became trapped without food. However, even within the harsh realities of frontier survival, the details of Packer's story seemed difficult to reconcile. Officials at the agency listened carefully as he described the final days of the expedition. But the more he spoke, the more inconsistencies appeared. When asked specific questions about the location of the deaths or the sequence of events, his answers were sometimes vague or contradictory. Some witnesses later reported that his story seemed to change depending on who was asking the questions. Another troubling detail soon became apparent. In addition to the belongings he carried, Packer also possessed a noticeable amount of cash. For a man who had supposedly spent weeks starving in the wilderness, this raised further suspicion. If his companions had died gradually along the trail, how had he managed to gather so many of their valuables? Rumors began spreading quickly among the people at the agency. Frontier settlements were small, and news traveled fast. The idea that a man had survived by eating his companions was already disturbing, but the possibility that those companions might not have died naturally was even more unsettling. Officials decided that the situation required closer investigation. Packer was placed under arrest while authorities attempted to gather more information about the fate of the missing men. At that time, law enforcement in the frontier territories operated under difficult conditions. Communication between settlements was slow, and many regions were too remote for immediate investigation. Still, the disappearance of 5 men demanded answers. While under questioning, Packer eventually admitted that he had consumed the flesh of his companions after their deaths. He described the act as a desperate measure necessary for survival. According to his account, starvation had forced him to do what he otherwise never would have considered. But even this admission did not settle the growing doubts surrounding his story. Investigators wanted to know exactly how the men had died and where their bodies could be found. Without physical evidence from the mountains, it was impossible to verify Packer's claims. The San Juan wilderness covered thousands of square miles, and locating a campsite weeks after a winter expedition would be extremely difficult. Before a full investigation could begin, however, an unexpected development occurred. Packer escaped. Details of the escape remain somewhat unclear, but at some point after his arrest, he managed to slip away from custody and disappear. In the vast landscape of the American West during the 1870s, this was not as unusual as it might seem today. Law enforcement resources were limited, and large areas of territory had few officers or organized search efforts. Once Packer vanished, tracking him became nearly impossible. The frontier offered countless places where a man could disappear. Mining camps, railroad construction sites, and remote settlements constantly attracted transient workers who arrived without documentation or long-term connections to the community. A person willing to adopt a new name could often blend into these environments without attracting attention. For the moment, the mystery surrounding the missing prospectors remained unresolved. The only witness to the expedition's fate had vanished into the Western Territories, leaving behind more questions than answers. Without Packer's testimony or physical evidence from the mountains, authorities could do little more than speculate about what had happened. But the mountains themselves still held the truth. As winter slowly gave way to spring and the deep snow of the San Juan Range began to melt, the landscape started to reveal what it had concealed for months. Trails that had been buried beneath drifts began to reappear. Valleys that had been inaccessible during the coldest part of the season slowly opened once again to travelers. And somewhere within those mountains lay the remains of 5 missing men. When they were finally discovered later that year, the scene investigators encountered would raise even more disturbing questions about what had truly happened during those desperate weeks in the wilderness. Chapter 4. Dead Man's Gulch. For months after Alfred Packer disappeared from custody, the fate of the 5 missing prospectors remained unknown. The San Juan Mountains were vast, and during the winter of 1874, much of the region had been inaccessible. Deep snow had concealed the landscape where the men had last traveled. Trails were buried, campsites hidden, and any evidence of what had occurred was locked beneath layers of ice and drifting powder. But as spring turned into summer, the mountains slowly began to change. Snow melted from the lower valleys first, revealing patches of ground that had not been seen for months. Streams swelled with meltwater, and the forests gradually returned to life. Travel through the region became possible again, and prospectors once more began moving through the San Juan Range in search of mineral deposits. It was during this period, in August of 1874, that the mystery of the missing expedition took a grim turn. An illustrator named Ralph Meeker was traveling through the region gathering sketches of the western frontier. Artists and reporters often ventured into mining regions during this era, documenting the expansion of settlements and the rugged lives of the people who lived there. While moving through a remote valley, Meeker came upon something that immediately caught his attention. The area was a small, sheltered basin surrounded by steep slopes and scattered timber. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary campsite, but as he approached, he realized that the ground nearby contained human remains. 5 bodies lay within the clearing. The discovery was shocking. The men had clearly been dead for months, but the melting snow had finally exposed the site. Their clothing and equipment were scattered around the camp, and the condition of the remains suggested that something far more violent than simple starvation had taken place. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the region. Local authorities and investigators soon arrived to examine the scene. In frontier communities, investigations were often conducted under difficult conditions. There were no modern forensic laboratories, and medical examiners were limited in the tools available to them. Nevertheless, the investigators attempted to carefully document what they found. The position of the bodies raised immediate questions. Rather than being scattered across a long trail, all 5 of the men were found in the same general location. This detail conflicted with Alfred Packer's earlier explanation. He had suggested that his companions had died gradually while traveling through the mountains. According to that story, their bodies would likely have been found spread along the route the group had taken. Instead, the remains were concentrated in one small area. This suggested that the men had spent a significant amount of time together at the same campsite before their deaths occurred. Perhaps they had stopped to rest, or perhaps they had become too weak to continue traveling any farther. Investigators began examining the condition of the skeletons more closely. Several of the skulls showed clear fractures. These injuries appeared consistent with blunt force trauma, damage caused by heavy blows rather than natural causes. In addition, the bones displayed numerous cut marks where flesh had been removed. There was little doubt that the bodies had been butchered. The evidence strongly supported Packer's admission that human flesh had been consumed. But the presence of head injuries raised an even more disturbing possibility. If the men had died solely from starvation, there would be no reason for their skulls to be fractured in such a manner. The scene suggested that violence had occurred before or around the time of their deaths. However, determining the exact sequence of events proved extremely difficult. Months had passed since the tragedy had taken place. Weather, animals, and natural decay had altered the condition of the remains. Some injuries might have occurred after death, while others could have happened during the final struggle for survival. Without eyewitnesses, the investigators could only form theories. Some believed the group had simply reached a breaking point after weeks of starvation. Desperation might have triggered a violent conflict among the men as they fought over dwindling supplies. Others suspected something more deliberate, that one individual had killed the others in order to survive. Naturally, suspicion focused on Alfred Packer. He was the only member of the expedition known to have survived. He had been in possession of the victims' belongings when he appeared at the Los Pinos agency months earlier. And he had already admitted to eating the bodies after their deaths. Now the physical evidence from the campsite appeared to contradict parts of his story. The discovery of the bodies intensified efforts to locate him. Authorities believed that capturing Packer would be the only way to determine what had truly happened in the mountains. But tracking a fugitive across the western frontier was not easy. The American West during the 1870s was enormous and sparsely populated. Mining towns appeared and disappeared quickly, and travelers frequently moved between territories searching for work. A man who wished to vanish could simply adopt a different name and move to another region where no one recognized him. For nearly a decade, Alfred Packer remained missing. Meanwhile, the story of the San Juan expedition spread far beyond Colorado. Newspapers began reporting on the case, often exaggerating details to capture readers' attention. The idea that a group of prospectors had perished in the mountains and that one survivor might have murdered and eaten the others captured the public imagination. The remote valley where the bodies were discovered soon gained a grim reputation. People began referring to the location as Dead Man's Gulch. The name reflected both the tragedy that had occurred there and the unanswered questions that surrounded it. What exactly had happened among the 6 men during those desperate weeks in the mountains? Had starvation driven them to madness? Had a violent struggle erupted among the group? Or had one man deliberately turned against the others in order to survive? The mountains offered no answers. For years, the events that took place at that lonely campsite remained one of the most unsettling mysteries of the frontier. The bodies had been found, but the truth behind their deaths was still missing. And the only man who might have been able to explain it was still somewhere out in the vast American West. Chapter 5. Capture and Trial. For nearly 9 years after the discovery at Dead Man's Gulch, Alfred Packer remained a ghost in the American West. Following his escape from custody in 1874, authorities had little ability to track him across the enormous frontier. Law enforcement in the Western Territories was limited, and communication between settlements could take weeks or months. Without photographs, centralized records, or modern identification systems, a fugitive could often disappear simply by traveling far enough and adopting a different name. That appears to be exactly what Packer did. Throughout the late 1870s and early 1880s, he moved through various parts of the Western Territories, reportedly working small jobs and blending into frontier communities where newcomers were common. Mining towns, railroad construction camps, and isolated settlements frequently saw large numbers of transient laborers. Few people asked questions about a man's past as long as he was willing to work. But stories of the San Juan tragedy had not completely faded. Newspapers continued to mention the case occasionally, often referring to Packer as a fugitive cannibal who had vanished somewhere beyond the reach of the law. Over time, the story became part of frontier legend, discussed in saloon conversations and repeated in newspaper columns that sometimes blurred the line between fact and rumor. Then, in 1883, a breakthrough occurred. In a small town in Wyoming Territory, a man recognized Packer living under the name John Schwartza. Word of the recognition spread quickly, and local authorities were notified. After years of uncertainty, the man long believed to be responsible for one of the frontier's most disturbing mysteries was finally located. Packer was arrested and returned to Colorado to face trial. The case immediately attracted widespread attention. By the early 1880s, Colorado had become a much more organized state than it had been when the original expedition disappeared. Newspapers reported extensively on the upcoming trial, and many members of the public were eager to learn what had truly happened in the mountains nearly a decade earlier. Under questioning, Packer presented yet another version of the events. According to this new account, the expedition had indeed become stranded in the mountains after running out of food. The men grew increasingly weak as starvation set in. Eventually, tensions within the group escalated as their situation became more desperate. Packer claimed that one of the men, Shannon Wilson Bell, had suddenly become violent. In his story, Bell allegedly killed the other members of the group while they were too weak to defend themselves. Packer said he had been away from the campsite searching for food when the attacks occurred. When he returned, he discovered the bodies of his companions and Bell preparing to kill him as well. According to Packer, he shot Bell in self-defense. With all 5 of the other men now dead, Packer claimed he had no choice but to eat the bodies in order to survive long enough to escape the mountains. He portrayed himself not as a murderer, but as the final victim of a tragedy caused by starvation and madness. The story was dramatic, but many investigators remained skeptical. The physical evidence discovered at Dead Man's Gulch did not clearly support Packer's explanation. Although the remains showed signs of violence, the arrangement of the bodies suggested that events may not have occurred exactly as he described. Additionally, witnesses remembered that Packer's earlier statements at the Los Pinos agency had contained several inconsistencies. As the trial approached, prosecutors prepared to present their case. In 1883, Alfred Packer stood trial for the murders of the 5 men who had disappeared with him in the San Juan Mountains nearly 9 years earlier. The courtroom proceedings drew intense public interest. Many people wanted to see justice served, while others were fascinated by the bizarre circumstances surrounding the case. During the trial, attorneys examined Packer's various versions of the story. Each account differed slightly from the previous one, making it difficult for the defense to establish a consistent narrative. Prosecutors argued that these contradictions suggested he had been hiding the truth from the beginning. Witnesses also testified about Packer's appearance when he arrived at the Los Pinos agency in 1874. Several people recalled that he did not look like a man who had endured weeks of starvation. That observation cast doubt on his claim that he had been barely surviving when he left the mountains. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached a verdict. Alfred Packer was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The sentence was dramatic, but the legal battle was not over. Shortly after the conviction, complications arose regarding Colorado's legal system. At the time the killings had occurred in 1874, the region where they took place had technically fallen under a different territorial jurisdiction before Colorado achieved full statehood. Because of this legal issue, the conviction was overturned on appeal. A new trial was ordered, forcing the courts to reconsider the case. By the time the second trial began several years later, memories had faded and many details remained uncertain. Nevertheless, prosecutors again presented evidence linking Packer to the deaths of the 5 men. This time, the jury reached a slightly different conclusion. Rather than convicting him of murder, they found him guilty of 5 counts of manslaughter. The court sentenced him to 40 years in prison. For many observers, the verdict reflected the strange nature of the case. There was little doubt that cannibalism had occurred. Packer himself had admitted as much. But determining exactly who had killed whom, or whether some of the men had died naturally before violence began, remained extremely difficult. The San Juan tragedy had occurred nearly a decade earlier in one of the most remote areas of the country. Much of the evidence had been lost to time and weather. What the court could say with certainty was that 5 men had died in the mountains, and Alfred Packer was the only one who returned alive. With the sentence handed down, Packer was sent to prison to begin serving his term. But the mystery surrounding the events in the San Juan Mountains was far from finished. Even as the legal case came to a close, historians and investigators would continue debating exactly what had happened during those desperate weeks of 1874. Chapter 6. The Forensic Mystery. By the early 20th century, the case of Alfred Packer had already passed into legend. Newspapers, books, and frontier folklore had retold the story many times, often embellishing details or adding dramatic speculation. For some people, Packer was remembered simply as the Colorado cannibal. For others, he represented a darker symbol of the brutal realities of survival in the American wilderness. Yet despite the dramatic trial and conviction, one central question remained unresolved. What had actually happened in the San Juan Mountains during the winter of 1874? The legal proceedings had determined that Packer bore responsibility for the deaths of the 5 men who traveled with him. But the courts had never been able to reconstruct the exact sequence of events at the isolated campsite, later known as Dead Man's Gulch. Without modern forensic tools, investigators in the 19th century could only rely on basic observations and witness testimony. For decades, the physical remains of the victims remained buried, and the mystery rested largely in the realm of speculation. Then, more than a century after the tragedy, scientists decided to re-examine the case using modern forensic methods. In 1989, researchers exhumed the remains of the 5 men who had died in the San Juan expedition. The goal was to determine whether scientific analysis might reveal new details about how the men had died. Advances in forensic anthropology now allowed investigators to examine skeletal remains with far greater precision than had been possible during the 19th century. When the bones were studied, several important observations were confirmed. First, there was no doubt that cannibalism had occurred. The skeletal remains showed clear-cut marks where flesh had been removed from the bones. These marks were consistent with the use of knives or other cutting tools. Similar patterns have been documented in archaeological sites where animals or humans were butchered for consumption. This finding aligned with Packer's own admission that he had eaten the bodies of his companions after their deaths. But the analysis also revealed signs of trauma that could not easily be explained by butchering alone. Several skulls displayed fractures consistent with blunt force injuries. In forensic terms, such damage might be caused by heavy blows from a weapon, a tool, or even a large rock. Determining whether these injuries occurred before or after death, however, proved much more difficult. Some fractures appeared to have occurred around the time of death, suggesting the men might have suffered violent attacks. Other marks could have resulted from damage that occurred after death during the process of cutting the bodies apart. The problem for investigators was that more than 100 years had passed since the incident. Weather, soil conditions, and animal activity had altered the remains over time. Small details that might have provided clear answers in a modern investigation had been lost long ago. The scientists studying the bones could identify patterns of injury, but they could not reconstruct the exact sequence of events. The forensic evidence therefore supported several different possibilities. One possibility was that the men had indeed died gradually from starvation and exposure, as Packer had originally claimed. In this scenario, the fractures might have occurred after death while the bodies were being processed for consumption. Another possibility was that a violent confrontation had taken place among the group. Extreme hunger and psychological stress can push people toward desperate actions. If the men had begun fighting over food or survival, some of the injuries might reflect that conflict. A third possibility was the one prosecutors had argued during the trial, that Alfred Packer himself had killed the others in order to survive. The forensic evidence could not fully confirm or reject any of these theories. Researchers studying the remains ultimately reached a cautious conclusion. The injuries demonstrated that violence had occurred, but the evidence did not clearly reveal who was responsible or exactly how the deaths unfolded. More than a century later, the mountains still guarded their secrets. Alfred Packer himself had long since passed away. After serving 18 years in prison, he was released on parole in 1901. He spent the final years of his life quietly in Colorado, far removed from the intense public attention that had once surrounded him. He died in 1907. By that time, the San Juan tragedy had already become one of the most infamous stories associated with the American frontier. Historians, journalists, and storytellers continued to debate the case, each attempting to interpret the limited evidence left behind. Some believed Packer had been a murderer who carefully manipulated his story in order to escape responsibility for killing his companions. Others believed he may have been telling at least part of the truth, that the group had collapsed into chaos after weeks of starvation, and that the final moments of the expedition were too confused and desperate for anyone to fully explain afterward. Without witnesses and without complete physical evidence, the true sequence of events may never be known. What is certain is that 6 men entered the San Juan Mountains during the winter of 1874. Only one returned alive. Somewhere in a remote valley surrounded by snow-covered peaks, 5 men lost their lives during one of the harshest winters in the Rocky Mountains. Their story reflects the dangers of frontier exploration, the fragile boundary between survival and desperation, and the terrible decisions human beings may face when isolated from the rest of the world. The San Juan Mountains remain as rugged and imposing today as they were in the 19th century, and the events that took place there continue to echo through history as one of the most unsettling mysteries of the American West.